The reformer John Calvin was on the run and had left France, where the conflict between Protestants and Catholics had worsened. Even though he was personally affected by the persecution, he hesitated to commit himself fully. By this time, the confrontations threatened to spread into a raging fire across all of Europe. Catholics and Protestants were accusing each other of heresy. Meanwhile, Calvin was in search of protection. Unlike Luther, he did not have powerful allies. In the Swiss city of Basel, the French Huguenots would later found the huge chemical works, maybe as an expression of the great desire to work that goes back to Calvin's theology. Here Calvin had the opportunity in just a short time to write his great work, Institutio Christianae Religionis, Institutes of the Christian Religion. The book was the fruit of his experiences and also proof of his intellect. With his Institutio, Calvin also showed himself to be at the forefront of the religious confrontation of his time. He was an equal to the other great reformers such as Zwingli and Luther.
Calvin became a reformer very late. He made decisions very slowly and he worked very thoroughly. I'd also say he's the most educated and intelligent of all the reformers. He was very well educated, but then still decided to become an anti-humanist in a certain sense.
Well prepared, John Calvin quickly completed his seminal work. Its contents would later have a global effect and was maybe also one of the most important works of the early modern period.
Institutio Christianae Religionis is Calvin's magnum opus, which was published in many editions during the course of his life. Here you can see the sword that is supposed to take out the soul of the believer and show him or her the truth of the gospel. Calvin published the Institutio in both French and Latin. Then there is this picture. It's not an engraving, it's a drawing. It's hard to see, but it contains the opening words of Institutio Christianae Religionis. It was written with a microscope. This portrait of Calvin says that his appearance is less important than what he has written. His work deeply shaped the Protestantism and the humanism of European society and European culture.
Mais aussi l'humanisme de la société européenne et de la culture européenne.
The extremely negative image of humanity in the Institutio does not come across as very humane.
If we look only at man's natural gifts, we won't find even a trace of good anywhere from head to toe. Everything that's in the slightest laudable about him comes from God's grace.
I think the negative depiction of human nature is one of the weaknesses of the Reformation period, even though it is somewhat liberating. If I have to expect everything from myself, from my life and my actions in order to have a successful life, then, with my limited opportunities, I can soon give up. But if I assume not everything is possible, and that these flaws are part of what it is to be human, then I can use these foundations to explore my potential, and I can do that together with other people too.
A person only achieves the right self-knowledge when he is completely humiliated through the awareness of his distress, his shortcomings, his nakedness, and his shame. Because there is no danger that a person will deny himself too much. All he has to recognize is that he can regain from God what he lacks.
dass in Gott wieder zu erlangen ist, was ihm fehlt.
Die Radikalität der Sünde wird
He
hervorgehoben.
emphasizes the radical nature of sin, but human misery is not so much in the foreground. There is a part of the imago Dei that is still intact.
Die noch integer ist.
Imago Dei means man is the image of God. But is that really true? Or is he a sinner through and through? Both notions affected the influence of Calvinist theology. In some cases, Calvinism became yet more severe. Authoritarian church communities formed worldwide. But on the other hand, the idea of humans being similar to God favored liberal movements. Calvin's own life was uneasy. He was invited to Geneva by the reformer William Farel, who wanted his help in the creation of a congregation. Calvin agreed and tried to implement his goals together with Farel. But it wasn't long before he was driven out of the city by the opposition. He worked as a pastor in Strasbourg for a while, but soon he was once again called in by Geneva's citizens. Calvin hesitated.
Nach Genf.
I should go to Geneva to have a better life. I might as well take up the cross immediately. It would be better to die instead of being tortured over and over. There is no place on earth I'm more scared of. My soul quakes when I think of the past and the prospect of resuming this struggle.
Ich denke, dass ich alle diese Kämpfe wieder aufnehmen soll.
But Calvin chose in favor of Geneva. Geneva became the place for Calvin where he first attempted to implement his ideas of a religious way of life. At the time, Geneva was a city with a confident citizenry. Its inhabitants wanted new religious orientations for political reasons. In addition, they had had enough of the shackles of the Catholic House of Savoy. Calvin, the refugee from France, came in handy, but he was only tolerated for as long as it was in the interests of the civic leaders.
Es ging die
This was about the independence of the city of Geneva.
Genf. Die reformatorische,
The reformatory aims had the character of a liberation movement there.
den Charakter eines Befreiungskampfes gehabt.
John Calvin was active in Geneva for many years. He spent time developing his teachings. One idea came more and more into the foreground. Its radical nature shocked even the reformers' contemporaries. It would later lead to the fragmentation of the reformatory movement. This idea was that of double predestination. It assumes that God predestines people's lives and salvation, but through the strength of their faith, they can bring about the fate God planned for them.
Unter Vorsehung.
By providence, we mean God's eternal order, by which He decides what should happen to each and every person.
Aus jedem einzelnen Menschen werden sollte. Denn die Menschen werden nicht
Human
alle
beings
mit der
are
gleichen
not
Bestimmung.
all created with the same destiny.
Den einen,
God predestines some for eternal life
anderen
and others
die ewige
for eternal
Verdammnis
damnation.
vorher zugeordnet.
Es ist schon so, dass immer wieder sucht.
He repeatedly tries to show that double predestination isn't fatalism, as the negative interpretation would have it. That's just lazy reasoning. You mustn't shrug and say, it's all predestined anyway. This is about strong faith. Faith now provides a sense of security, of being one of the chosen ones. It takes the fear away.
Wirklich in diesem Sinne einem die Sicherheit gibt, erwählt zu sein, einem die
It also means that you treat your environment, your wife, your friend, your children differently.
mit ihrer Frau, ihrem Freund, ihren Kindern.
Ich gehöre nicht zu der Verrückten.
I'm not one of that crazy kind of lover who even praises the loved one's flaws once they have become smitten by their beauty. The only kind of beauty that attracts me is the one that's modest, obedient, humble, frugal and patient. I'm also hopeful it bears upon my health.
Darf, dass sie zu meiner Gesundheit Sorge trägt.
Calvin married the widow Idelette de Burgh in Strasbourg in 1540. Soon they had a child together. But after just a few years, both mother and child fell ill with an incurable disease. Blows of fate like this one were accepted by Calvin as something God wanted. It was not a reason for him to interrupt his work.
If you look at Calvin's marital history, it would be fair to say he wasn't overly excited about it. I think he just wanted to prove that a celibate life is completely unnecessary and idiotic. He approached the whole thing in such an intellectual manner until he found a woman that approximately fitted his ideas. He only wanted this woman to make his everyday life easier. He wanted full-day assistance with few nighttime absences. But when his wife unfortunately died very early, he immediately buried the project and decided not to repeat it.
From the point of view of church politics, Zurich was an opposite pole to Geneva. It was in the sphere of influence of the reformer Huldrych Zwingli, who started yet another branch of theological renewal. There was particular disagreement between the followers of Zwingli and Calvin when it came to the Eucharist. According to Zwingli, God was only present in the memory of the congregation, while Calvin emphasized God's full spiritual presence during the celebration.
In Zwingli's theology, there are certain rationalistic sections that fit in very well with the Enlightenment worldview. When Zwingli says the congregation is the subject of the action, then that's completely in line with the Enlightenment. But when Calvin expresses the triumph of grace over the sinful man, it's evident that that doesn't sit well with Enlightenment ideas at all.
Calvin's criticism of worldly power was of great significance. He even urged people to stand up to princes and kings in conflicts between secular and religious ideals.
In places that have popular local government, I don't forbid these men to confront the wild freedom of kings. If they turn a blind eye to kings who are self-indulgent rulers and torture the general populace, then this deliberate turning of a blind eye is a betrayal. Because with this disdainful deception, they betray the freedom of the people, whose guardians they have been made by God's command, as they well know.
Ideas like this one later led to a theology in which democracy and personal responsibility dominated.
He was of the opinion that God alone was to be the recipient of honor. Over the years, Calvin became increasingly forceful about this point. He said, the monarchy is one of the greatest of all evils. A collective, a community is always needed to govern people's lives.
This idea of a harmonious collective is expressed most completely in the picture The Paradise of Lyon, which depicts the preacher of God's word in amongst his congregation. In the meeting hall in Leiden in the Netherlands, where the elders of the congregation convened, the effect of Calvinism really becomes clear. Bright colors were unleashed as they were permitted in those places where the object was not God, but our world. The golden age of the Netherlands was in any case closely connected with Calvin's world of ideas.
People think of the Netherlands as a Calvinist country, and historians spend a lot of their time explaining that not all Dutch people were ever Calvinist. On the other hand, Calvinism has been incredibly important in the formation of an independent Dutch state in the late 16th century and has dominated public religious life in the 17th and 18th centuries because other churches were all banned. So in the Dutch Golden Age, the only religion permitted publicly permitted was the Reformed religion.
In the 17th century, Leiden formed a cultural hub for Calvinist and Reform movements. It was here in particular that the Puritans from neighboring England came in search of refuge. A fresh intellectual wind was blowing in Leiden that also attracted the Pilgrim Fathers to the Netherlands, especially since they were being persecuted by the Anglicans in England.
Their theological objections were seen as traitorous by the English crown, so they had to flee. And if they wanted to maintain their ideas, they came to Leiden first and found they could indeed believe what they wanted. They could even preach their ideas because they were very orthodox. They could have their own gathering. But in the end, they did not feel at home in the Dutch Reformed Church. Well, they didn't find it strict enough, and they were not happy and decided to move on and move to America.
The global effect of Calvinism often seems mysterious to us today because many Protestant religious communities only have vestiges of his doctrine within them. Geneva remained Calvin's immediate sphere of influence. Was it a theocrat or a pioneer of democracy and social welfare who was at work here? Calvin created a structured church order that intervened in people's everyday lives. His church discipline, a collection of rules that clearly corresponded to his character, became famous.
May this be a clear description of the power the preachers in the church are given. Since they are only employed to be the governors and proclaimers of God's word, they have to risk everything. They have to force all the great and powerful to bow down to God's majesty and to serve him.
He spent his time teaching. We're in the Auditoire Calvin. Here he taught, and taught some more in order to prevent the decline of morals. He didn't want to reduce the pressure. In fact, he wanted to be even stricter. Teaching requires discipline. It requires a timetable. And the boys who went to the school and the academy had a strict discipline, so that their instruction was also a proper upbringing. They were brought up to be new people, if I can put it like that.
L'éducation à un homme nouveau, si on peut dire.
Today, the people of Geneva see themselves as the heirs of this Calvinist tradition. But on the other hand, we're also open to culture. That's the spirit we nurture here at the university. And we hope that Calvinism can continue helping us interpret the world, the economy, society, the family, and all the other questions that move us.
Et l'ensemble des questions auxquelles nous sommes confrontés, c'est vrai que le calvinisme...
Calvinism has always focused on ethics, and that's still part of its task.
C'est une partie de sa mission encore aujourd'hui.
Even then, the case of Michel Servet attracted a lot of interest. Servet was a free thinker who denied the Holy Trinity, an absolute taboo none of the Christian churches attacked. When Servet came to Geneva, the council had him arrested and thrown into jail with Calvin's consent. Calvin also agreed to his opponents being sentenced to death. The story that Calvin went to Servet's cell the night before the execution in order to get him to change his mind is also authenticated. But when he failed to listen, Calvin felt his rigid verdict justified.
Calvin really sent an opponent, a Spanish monk called Servet, to be burnt at the stake. He did this behind the scenes. He pulled the strings. And it should not be forgotten that he allowed this most brutal form of execution.
The Austrian writer Stefan Zweig later described the day of the execution in a polemically colored biography. Calvin, who seemed to Zweig both radical and intolerant on the one hand, and hesitant and indecisive on the other, hid away at home on the day of the execution, crouched behind his window as if he wanted to undo the gruesome deed somehow. The burning of Michel Servet has been used time and again as a cause to judge the reformer John Calvin.
When people say he was someone who didn't have much patience for tolerance, that's correct. But it was the flip side to an extremely effective battle for the survival of a faith. And that context allows us to take many of the images that repel us and that rightly seem negative to us and put them in the right light.
The man who was still caught in the Middle Ages in his actions and his emotions was nonetheless aiming for reconciliation in many matters, particularly when it came to bringing together the different reform movements throughout Europe. Calvin proved to be more tolerant than others. Thus, Switzerland never saw religious wars like many other European countries. Instead, Calvin came into conflict with Geneva's wealthy citizenry because he was always at pains to help refugees and the poor.
The poor don't need pity, they need justice. And they get justice when they cease to be treated like poor people. That's something these classes in Geneva didn't like to hear.
Calvin destroyed himself through his work. His inhuman strictness towards himself caused him more and more physical afflictions.
I see myself as somebody who is shy, weak, and faint-hearted. I keep pain locked inside of me so that I don't interrupt my work in any way.
Calvin worked in Geneva for more than 20 years. Finally, his strength was all used up. His death was nigh. John Calvin left an ordered community behind at the end of his life. But others saw the precursors to dictatorial systems of state and society in this regulated world. Calvin died on the 27th of May, 1564. He expressed his radical nature once more shortly before his death in a merciless self-assessment.
I've had many weaknesses which you have had to endure, and everything I've done has basically been worthless. The bad people will definitely exploit this statement. But I want to say once again that all my actions were worth nothing, and that I am a wretched creature. But I can say of myself that I wanted the good, that I've always disliked my flaws, and that the root of the fear of God was always in my heart.
John Calvin. Even a resume of his life is difficult, let alone a judgment about his effect. Calvinism expresses itself as a large number of different ideas that go back to Calvin, to the way he led his life and to his teachings. In the context of religious history, he was one reformer amongst others. However, in a context of intellectual history that leads to our modern ideas, his significance can hardly be exaggerated. Existential questions like, how do we live? What do we do? And why do we do it? Are all questions John Calvin had radical answers for. He pointed the way toward capitalism.
When we look at the development of capitalist economic systems, the concept of trade or profession in people's minds is more important. People didn't practice their worldly occupations in the sense of a modern job. For them, it was a place chosen for them by God, and so they basically did their job as a kind of service to God.
In addition, Calvin brought the relationship between human beings and God onto a modern foundation. It is a sovereign, intangible God that allows us to understand the world.
It was important to Calvin that there weren't any inexplicable phenomena in this world that could be explained without God. And I think that's something people have really taken on board. They don't have to be scared of inexplicable things. They know they can face them and that they will be able to explain them with their intellect.
Sondern dass sie sich dem zuwenden können und dass sie es auch mit ihrem Verstand erklären können.
Who is God? Where is God? How does he act in the world? John Calvin tried to answer this question 500 years ago in a radical manner that can both confuse and fascinate us. The reformer from Geneva left behind a room full of open questions. Maybe it is his contradictions and paradoxes that make him so up to date, a founder of modernity.